This is Addison Shanland, and it's June 21, the equinox, as Julia just said. My guest today is Julia Reichel, who is how do we call it, a leadership person with extensive history in aviation and aerospace. You develop leadership for companies, Julia. Maybe I'm not so good at describing you. Perhaps you can give our audience a quick definition or description of yourself.
Be delighted to, Addison. Thank you for having me on. My role is at a business called Mercuri Urval. We're a global leadership development organization. We also do executive search, but at the center of what we do is leadership diagnostic assessment and development. Why in aerospace? I started life in the cabin of an airplane, became a commercial pilot, and then later on went into advisory and data services for companies like Gartner, Frost & Sullivan, travel technology research, then went into tech itself. And here I am, 25 years in aviation and aerospace, and I'm delighted to be doing what I do today.
Fantastic. So for the viewers, the focus of our conversation is on leadership and culture with respect to aerospace, and more specifically to the subject du jour these days, Boeing. And you've had experience doing leadership within the aerospace OEM's size and that sort of industry. So I think that you have a perspective which I think people should appreciate. So perhaps you also contacted Senator Blumenthal about the hearings this week. So it's obvious you're at a level which is serious. And the thing that was interesting from the hearing was there was so much talk about trust. So perhaps we should start there. How would you define trust, and why is trust crucial in aerospace or any large company?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really good starting point, Addison, because trust is sort of the connective tissue between a brand, its customers, its suppliers, and its employees. So, and in aerospace in particular, one of your previous guests, John Ostrower, said so nicely, trust is the currency of aerospace. And I couldn't agree with him more. When we lose trust in aerospace, bad things happen. But unfortunately, from where we were originally, where we are today in aerospace, the loss of trust is endemic. And why is that? Because we have moved into cost-conscious speed manufacturing. We want to manufacture faster, cheaper. We put pressure on suppliers. We have complex outsourcing relationships, a complex supply chain. And that leads to a very difficult task in continuing to build trust throughout that entire life cycle. Well, not to mention the aftermarket.
Right. It's interesting. You touched on something there that has come up in a few conversations this very week. And it occurred to me that the way to look at it is that in the silo that is commercial aviation, in the supply chain, you cannot screw a supplier. You cannot do that because it's going to come back to haunt you. It's a closed system.
Yeah.
And you cannot mess up with your supply chain. And of course, we see that when Boeing did the outsourcing for the 787 and how they were going to do that. And then they had Partnership for Success, which failed miserably. It's interesting. So let's look at Boeing specifically and its employees, because we've had the Great Retirement. And prior to that, Boeing has had several years of labor upsets and hiccups. The Great Retirement, where all the skilled people in this industry were given early buyouts, pilots, engineers, mechanics. And now, of course, we have this new learning. An example of somebody that I recently spoke with said the apprentice system, the master apprentice system, is completely out of balance. It's not the college degree people, it's the people who actually put things together. And you used to have one master, one apprentice. Now the one person was telling me they have one master and 6 apprentices. how does that master do any work? Because they have to watch 6 people, and aerospace is a zero tolerance for safety. You just don't compromise it. So it's fascinating. So I don't want to drag this, but how do you think Boeing lost the trust of its employees? Is it just the management? Was it the culture? What happened?
So I want to be very careful here that I'm not finger pointing, given that I am not working within Boeing, but I think there are some very clear messages that came out of the hearing with Senator Blumenthal and his team last week. And those issues that were described or highlighted are pretty endemic throughout the industry. So we work with suppliers and OEMs in this space, from fasteners and nuts and bolts through to engines and airframes. And interestingly, increasingly so in the eVTOL space, where we see a very, very different cultures emerging, and maybe that's one for another day. The traditional challenges that I think Boeing and most other manufacturers suffer from and have to address and are addressing are the fact that it's by definition very hierarchical and pretty authoritarian. Now, you would think that in a culture where you need processes, auditing, quality in order to thrive for safety, those would be core building blocks. But when they get out of hand, or they're in the mix with the other, let's say, toxic combinations, such as outsourcing, such as complex supply chains, and then potentially different sites. So yeah, you produce different things in different places, or even from different organizations. When you mix all of that together, you can come to a place where you are in a very disparate them and us culture. And that in turn then leads to blame. And when you are in a blaming, finger pointing culture, the bit we started with, trust and safety, are compromised.
Wow. Culture. Culture seems to be a big thing. How do we fix the culture there? Is culture the problem, and does one fix it? Can it be fixed?
You can fix culture. So my colleagues at Mercuri Urval have been doing this for 60 years. This is what we, spend our days doing. And yes, you can, but it requires a certain process. And often is said that culture change consultancies like us come in when the business consultancy and strategy consultancy has left. And I think that's quite a good way of looking at this, because ultimately it all boils down to the relationship between the purpose of the business. And so as a small side comment there, I have reviewed the purposes of the main aerospace organizations, and safety and people are in all of their purpose statements. So we start with a purpose, we move to business strategy. And then once the business strategy stands, one of the elements inevitably will be a people strategy. And I specifically use the term people and not human capital strategy, because what happens when I call it human capital, people get dehumanized. They're just another asset. And we cannot treat people like assets. We need to treat people like people. So a people strategy really is there to translate the business strategy into how do we deal with our people. And as a company, we've been doing this, as I said, for many years, and we have some very exciting projects and programs that we have run over the years where we have achieved this, where we have brought OEMs or manufacturers from a place of very disparate cultures, hierarchical, lack of accountability, blaming, to a very successful place a decade on, where speak up culture, trust, quality, diversity, not a human, not a women. How many women do we have? But true diversity to bring forward the best in this type of environment. So it absolutely can be done, but it has to come from the top. It has to be executed from the top. It has to be consistent, and it has to be science-backed. So you can't just come in and say, you all need to behave differently today. You need to work with what's called a competency framework that picks up what the people's strategy will be, and then creates a framework in which everybody at leadership and then further down the organization can behave and use as a reference.
So that's very, very structured and interesting. But there has to be some sort of change factor. There has to be the switch, right? So the question is that I'm thinking as you described this, what is the thing, what is the event that creates the change, the start of the change? You said it starts at the top. Does that mean potentially for like a Boeing, a new CEO, or can the current leadership do this and be credible and still recapture the culture, recapture the trust?
Again, I probably need to speak in fairly broad terms. I suspect that a change in leadership is inevitable, which is a real shame for people who have committed their careers to Boeing and have been there for 30 years, because they have just witnessed 3 or 4 or 5 years of complete stripping out of the C-suite, complete stripping out of the VP layers, and now for this to happen again. But, you know, I suspect from, again, experience, not pointing fingers and Mr. Calhoun and his team, but I know from experience then when a trigger event, such as a loss of a platform, which has led to loss of life, inevitably a change of leadership will be on the cards, and was called for in the panel on Tuesday, daytime your time, late evening my time. There were a few senators who were really pushing very hard on that topic. What I can say is that in clients we have worked with, when this kind of situation, and we need to consider how many factors contribute to this situation to get to this point, and how many years the malfunction has sort of rotted away, if you want to use that for no better term. We know from other clients that a change out in leadership at that top level is the trigger for a new way of running the company. Because fundamentally, yes, the purpose of the company stands, but the belief systems and the behaviors, the competency skills, attitudes, all the things we look for in the competency framework, you can't just change the chip on somebody and change that. So yes, I suspect for Boeing, a change in leadership will be very much on the cards.
Julia, if you were to look at success factors when you have a cultural change, could you give me like 3, or give us like, are there 3, are there 5? Is it much more, or can you distill it down to just a few things that you focus on?
Yes, it's a good question. So I think the number one thing is a solid science-based competency framework, so that everybody in the organization knows exactly what behaviors are expected of them. So to change from a hierarchical to a speak-up culture, let's assume that that is the purpose. We need to very clearly define what traits, skills, behaviors, attitudes somebody at leadership level should have, and to what level, so that we can then develop those further. So that would be the basis. The second, I think, would be consistency. So you need to commit to a program like this over a certain amount of time. This doesn't happen overnight. You have to accept that a lot of coaching has to take place. No business is a business without its people. So the people who naturally fit into this competency framework will do really well, and they will be able to drive forward the change. And then there will be people who need more coaching. But when you use a science-backed process, then you know exactly who needs what. And then I think, even though I've said consistency, the involvement with the business would be the last one I would bring to the table. So as the company develops, your leadership program has to develop as well, because you're now in a place where people have honed very different skills. They have adjusted their behaviors. It's trickling through the organization. And hopefully what you have created is a culture where speaking up about concerns, safety, let's go back to this one topic, and that is safety. You have to create a culture where even a cleaner, and I interviewed yesterday who was through one of our programs, had been with the company, the manufacturer, for 20 years, was in the top 100 of the organization. And he described the change to me as follows. He said, before we started this program, we, the top 100 in the organization, talked. Over the years of the program running, even a cleaner could come and raise the bell that something didn't feel right. And that became what he called the well-oiled whistleblower machine. And I love that, because it means everybody in an organization has the same value to contribute to the one thing that is so important, and that is safety. So on the one hand, we need the consistency, but on the other, we need to evolve with the program.
As I'm listening to you describe this, the visual going through my mind is the flow of information to decision makers, and the fact that she has to be unfiltered. And I'm thinking about, again, I come back to Boeing, over 100 years old, 107 years old. The culture there is probably more powerful than in arguably any other company in the world. How many companies are that old and being so successful? It is, in so many ways, it is the history of aerospace is the history of Boeing. If you think about Pratt & Whitney came out of the Boeing company, United Airlines came out of the Boeing company. It's just the elephant in the room, right? So and I hear you describe your example with even the cleaner could flow information into decision makers. So when people have gone through this process, I guess we talk about in the case of Boeing, again, not to that particular example, but it is the measuring stick for the conversation. And there's leadership change. What about the people who, when you have implemented this successfully, who are is it new leaders that you talk that can give you feedback, or how does that work?
So it depends on this idea of the competency framework. Yeah. So so you assess everybody for their suitability. You allow individuals to develop according to their strengths, but at the core really is the humanistic perspective. So we remove monolithic thinking, and we allow the development of diverse thinking. Diverse thinking means we accelerate communication, innovation, team collaboration. Those are those are the three things we strive for when, as a leader, we decide that diversity is something we want to embrace. So, and the reason why this is important is the diversity doesn't happen by saying we take everyone out and we replace them with new. That's very monolithic, and it's not the answer. So the replacement of leaders is absolutely based on the suitability of the competence that's required for their specific role. So think of this in very simplistic terms. The head of HR, or the CHRO, will have a very different competency profile to the chief finance officer. Why? Because this person over here has to deal with investors, run a P&L, advise on mergers, acquisitions, make decisions based on a spreadsheet and on ROI. This person over here has to have the same leadership and analytical skills, but also has to have people skills and other strategic tools in his or her handbag to deal with HR strategy. And then when you look at somebody who might be way further down the organization at, director level, as this sort of spreads out in a spider web, the competency profiles required become different for every role. So to say we need to take everyone out isn't the answer. We need to retain the DNA of the company, of the people that fit the new. Think of it as a sieve. Yeah. So some people will stick and some won't. And the people that do need developing because they can. And that's what we can bring out in this science-backed process where we look for traits, behavior, skills, and attributes in a way of self-assessing and by way of coaching and behavioral intervention with, a coach or a psychologist. And that's how you create that change.
Wow.
A
Fascinating.
lot of big words.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm trying to think about, taking the template that you've described, and I would imagine that in your line of work, everybody in this space has similar models and approaches, and trying to fit that over a culture that is so strong and so powerful that it probably has its own values and its own life. I'm thinking, for example, of people that tattoo brands on themselves. Harley Davidson, motorcycle people, they'll actually put that on their body. Boeing is probably the kind of company where there are people that will literally put that logo on their body. It's that much of a powerful, iconic brand. And how you affect change in something like this is absolutely fascinating, because I think everybody would agree there has to be something done, because where it's going is not going to be sustainable. There has to be a change, but the cultural thing that you've described is absolutely fascinating.
And we talked about this in the prep for all of this when I did my frozen ATPL CPL back 25 years ago. What's the plane I wanted to fly? Boeing. I wasn't interested in an Airbus or an Embraer or anyone listening from those manufacturers produce great airplanes. But to your point, Boeing equals aerospace, and that is a DNA and a legacy that this organization now has a fantastic opportunity to leverage, because people take pride in working there. And I think from a human perspective, this is what I found very difficult to watch over the last few years, that the people dedicated on the ground, the 30,000 engineers, one of the senators referred to the other day, who have dedicated their careers, they're not to blame. And we're not interested in blaming. We are simply interested in looking forward. How can you fix this? And I think what Boeing has going for it is that unbelievably strong brand globally with the airlines, but also in the US, the pride US citizens take in this brand. Boeing will never struggle to find good people. And that's the task right now. Find good people who create that turnaround, execute it with conviction, and accept that this is a crisis situation that needs to be dealt with.
Just the last point that I want to just throw in here, because it's interesting. You talk about the ability of the company to attract the skills it needs. We've been formed very reliably from several senior leaders in the industry who have been looked at as replacement, like the new CEO for Boeing. And the general response from people is, I won't go there. It's going to be bad for my resume because the culture is too toxic. It's a crying shame.
It is. And to be honest, Addison, I don't have an answer. But I think every company who has gone through a crisis like this, and maybe it's unrivaled just because of the succession of incidents. But I think there isn't one employee in Boeing that doesn't want to fix the problem. So I think an incoming CEO, with the help of, may it be in a Mercuri Urval or another organization that specializes in this type of change program, cultural change with defined outcomes, would find, I don't think they would find, of course it will be challenging, but I don't think they will find much resistance. Because what we see in situations like this is that the people who are off that guard will very naturally exit the organization, because it's not justifiable to argue this is an okay culture. So again, it's not about finger pointing, it's how can we get this organization back to producing safe airplanes that airlines want to buy, that lessors want to finance, and the consumer wants to get on, because that's ultimately where it all breaks down.
Right.
Well, the consumer says, I'm not flying with you, Mr. Airline, because you're flying the wrong airplane. And this is sort of this is the light on the horizon. And I think, so to kind of go ever so slightly back to the competency framework, you know, a CEO who is worried about the change that needs to happen. Imagine the fast forward in 5 years' time, in 7 years' time, when this is once again the shining star of
Right.
airframe manufacturing, and he or she and their team have created this, and the way we look at what drives people, you know, things like having a fighting spirit, wanting to be trusted, wanting to be part of a team that achieves something, how, you know, having prestige roles. We can look for those and we can hone them. So whoever is the incoming leadership team should definitely not do so by themselves. They need to do this as a collective. And yes, of course, the CEO, the buck stops with him or her, but he or she will have and build a leadership team based on what the business needs, hopefully, and bring people in who have those natural behaviors and strengths in order to create that change. And I think, so for me, you know, again, I've been, you know, a competitive athlete. You don't go into a cycle of competition not having the view how you're standing on the podium and you're lifting your medal or your trophy. And I think that's the mindset that we're looking for in that new CEO.
Julia, fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for speaking with me.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Addison. Thank you so much for having me.